Hello, my name is Kai, and I am a bit of a rambler. I like to travel, learn, and tell stories. And this one's about Palfish, the program I use to teach online. I taught in person, and then I left and went traveling for 3 years after working for 3.5 years. Then I had my own school for a couple of years. I went back to China, and then I started traveling again. During the time in between working in China at those two schools, there was like a 9 or 10 month period where I wanted to travel. I knew that I needed to start traveling again. But I wanted some kind of income, and I was already teaching, and I had heard about all of these online teaching platforms. None of them seemed very appealing to me right off the bat because I was leaving to travel because I had been working for 3.5 years straight, basically, creating curriculum and training teachers and finding new places and opening satellite classrooms. And yeah, the developing curriculum took a lot of time. But I threw myself so much into the work and this structure that I wanted to free myself up again and make sure I was doing what I wanted to do. So I didn't want a structured job again. I wanted to travel and go to a different country every month and just see new things and talk to people and have a great life. So I looked at all of the online platforms, and a lot of them were structured. You choose a time that you're available, you tell the platform, you make sure that you're available Wednesdays 4 to 7 p.m. or Mondays 12 to 3 p.m. It is still a very reasonable schedule, and you can still choose when you want to work or not work. But I didn't even want to do that much. I had given everything I had to this school, and I was drained of my tolerance for structure. So instead, I joined one of the several platforms where you could sign up without a TEFL certificate or really anything. I think I just applied and I had a very short interview, or maybe it was just an application. It's definitely changed the application rules, and China has since made it a requirement that a lot of online platforms require TEFL certificates if you become an online teacher. But at the time, you could just sign up. There were many more private companies dictating their own guidelines 15 years ago. Oh no, I guess this was closer to 10 years ago. But anyway, the one that caught my eye was Palfish. They had a cool logo, which I liked. Had a weird name, like most Chinese companies that choose English names. And it was completely open. You would install the teacher app, and then after your user profile was approved, after you applied and got approved and all that, you could sign into the teacher app. And there was a button that said offline. And when you clicked that button, it said online. And you could set your own rate of pay. And a lot of Chinese influencers actually started on this app. So they would make popular videos on Bilibili or whatever Chinese social media website there was at the time. And then they would be on Palfish, and you could call them up for the equivalent of like 10, 20 US dollars a minute. You could hold classes, and as many people as wanted could join. And those classes could go for 500 US each for like 45 minutes. It was pretty wild to see some of the influencers, some of the Chinese influencers just raking in so much cash. I wasn't very concerned about making a ton of money. I just figured if I could make a couple $100 a month, that would offset a lot of my cost because I was planning on staying in hostels and really just being on the ground level of traveling so that I could meet as many people as I could and walk around the city. And I generally don't travel too expensive because I like watching movies, reading comics, talking to people, hanging out, running, like exercising, a bunch of fairly inexpensive activities. And I also have an aversion to elitism, and there was definitely an elite class of people on a lot of these informal teaching apps like Palfish where you didn't actually have to teach anything. I mentioned the influencers, but there were also like popular influencer foreign expat people who had social media websites, and they also charged a lot of money. Like, I don't even know how much it was. But $5, I definitely remember seeing $5 a minute, $12 a minute, 12 US dollars a minute to talk to them. So when you clicked online, anyone who wanted to pay that much, they would have money in their account and they can call. And then each minute it counts off whatever pay rate you have set as the teacher, and that goes into your account. And then they pay you at the end of the month. Now, I had lived in China for a few years, so I knew how poor most of the country was, and also how cheap most of the country is. And I probably could have made a higher rate of pay for myself, and I did experiment a couple times, but I always felt weird charging 50 cents a minute or whatever like that. I knew I was a good teacher, and that's definitely much cheaper than you would pay to get a face-to-face tutor or like an official tutor in China. But I wasn't doing it really to work. I was fine. I wanted to make something for what I expected I'd have to I'd have to do a little bit of work on this platform, but I mostly just wanted to talk to people and see what it was like being an online teacher. So I wanted to make sure that everybody could contact me. So I set my rate at, you know what, I can't really remember actually. I think it was close to 1 yuan. I do remember that it turned out whatever it was, about 1 yuan per minute. And at the time it was 6.5 yuan were $1. So I was making about $10 an hour, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but a hostel is $90 a month in a lot of Asian countries. And I was going to be backpacking or going to a hostel in these Asian countries. And food is $1, maybe $3 for a whole plate. So if someone called up and talked to me for 20 minutes, I had a very large plate of food that I could pay for. And I had plenty of savings from my actual job teaching at the school and administrating stuff. So this was just like pocket change, and I would get to see what it was like to be an online teacher. And I got hooked pretty quick. Because, especially with the platform I was using, which allowed the teacher to set the curriculum, actually the teacher and the student would call up and tell you, hey, I want to study TEFL or vocabulary, or I just want to talk. It was very interesting on Palfish because I thought I would be teaching, but it would be just more casual. I would just be explaining things. They would have specific questions. I'd explain them. Get a couple bucks while I was backpacking to the next town. That's usually how I did it. I bought a SIM card in the airport of where I landed, let's say Taiwan, and then I would just click online. I'd walk around playing Pokemon Go, and if someone called up, then I would answer, and I'd talk to that person for 35 minutes, make $6, and then, okay, bye. And if I was good for the day, I'd click offline if I was like tired, but usually I just kept it online all the time and people called me up whenever. And since I was usually backpacking between two cities or towns or just walking around, yeah, it was fun. I would just get surprise conversations with people. I even got like prank phone calls from teenagers. They'd be like, hey, are you American? Yeah, America. And that became kind of a game where I would see if I could keep them on the line for 1 minute, because if it automatically pays the teacher after the first minute, every 60 seconds that you're talking to someone, it'll pay you. It doesn't pay you at 59 seconds, but as soon as 60, it pays you the 1 yuan. It just keeps counting. And so with a lot of them, I was like, oh, are you Chinese? And I get like really interested and like, oh, that's great. Are you guys at school right now? And every time I made it past like a minute, sometimes it was 5 minutes, and then they'd be like, oh, I have to go. And they'd hang up. And I every time like I got $1 from one of the prank phone calls, I'd be like, ha. And it wasn't taking up any of my time because that was just part of my day. I had all free time. But I got hooked so quickly, not because of the prank phone calls, but because of how fun the platform was. And those teenagery phone calls were part of that fun. But a huge part was that I wasn't teaching most of the time, which I didn't really expect. When they called up, easily like 25%, 30%, 1 in 3 people maybe, would just say, hey, I know that you're a teacher, I understand that, but I kind of just want to talk to somebody. Is that okay? And when the first person, probably like the third person that called me or something, asked me if we could just have a casual conversation instead of any formally structured lesson, I was like, yeah, 100%. That's what I actually want to do here, so that's perfect. It would still technically be language practice for them, but what quickly became apparent was that because of how tightly regimented Chinese society is and how strict it is, this sphere of online English teaching had become this sort of haven for Chinese people, young and old. I literally talked to like 3-year-olds, and then I also talked to 70-year-olds, to ask me questions about China that they could never ask another Chinese person, because you aren't supposed to ask about anything that like isn't societally Chinese. You can't question the system. At that time, there wouldn't be like legal punitive measures, but it was just expected. Like, this is how the country, this is how the world is. So they couldn't ask a Chinese person questions they had about dating, or questions they had about having children, or studying at other universities, because if it was not the line that you are supposed to say, like for dating, it would be, oh, well, just wait for your mom. She'll introduce you to someone soon. Or having children, well, when you find your heterosexual partner, you will have a baby 2.5 years after. And like, there's one way to do it in China, and that is the correct way. And you simply are not allowed to ask a question about the correct way or talk about it. So all of a sudden, I was having some of the most stimulating and interesting and educational conversations, deep philosophical conversations with Chinese people that I had ever had. And I had lived in the country for over 3 years, and I had really good friends, and I had had these deep conversations before, but they were very few and far between. Because, like I said, they can't talk to a Chinese person, but also once they know me, they have to represent themselves on some level as a Chinese ambassador of their culture and their way of life. I have like 2 friends who managed to throw the shackles of cultural chains off, and we can talk pretty freely. But for the most part, even knowing me face to face, I would get these questions, but it wouldn't be a prolonged conversation. They would get the specific answer, and then they'd be like, okay. And you could just see that they felt like they had crossed a line because they were talking in China about Chinese things, as if maybe they weren't the only option or the only method with which to do something, which is like anathema to Chinese society and Chinese civilization. And you have to remember that all these, like, there's a whole generation of people who were alive when Mao Zedong was in power, a complete totalitarian who could evict people from their homes. He often evicted entire towns and said, you have to go live in the mountain because we don't have food for you. So you have to go find your food in the mountain and live there. I talked to like this old lady who as a child had been sent from her town into the mountains, every like second child, and the girls, of course, because Mao Zedong only wanted the boys so they could build things for him. And she, along with all the other girls and a few of the boys, were sent into the mountains to fend for themselves. And she lived there for like 12 years in the mountains, just surviving until she got to go back into the city. And then she lived her life. She got a job somehow when she got back. And I think I remember she liked books, so it was actually about something with print media or something. I can't really remember. But it was some sort of skilled work, professional work. It wasn't menial labor. It was when she first got there. She got back and she like cooked in a restaurant for a day, but she did get a job as a editor or copy editor or something eventually. And I was just wrapped with this insane tale that I didn't even know about until she told me that. And everyone in China knew that. I talked to all of my friends and they were like, oh yeah, there just wasn't enough food, so they had to send some of the people into the mountains. But it wasn't some of them. It was half a generation of children, basically, who were exiled from their towns because they didn't have the food to give them according to Mao Zedong's structure of how a town should look. Like, it was, wow. That's such a big chapter of Chinese history that I didn't hear about. Oh, but what I mentioned, so 1 in 3 people would just ask me, they'd call up and just say, hey, can we just have a conversation? I'm not really looking for formal teaching. And when they say that, I'd get really excited and be like, yeah, what'd you do yesterday, today, what's up? Or what do you think about Pokemon? Or when was the last time you had Hot Pot? What's your favorite city? And we would just start talking. And I could have 4-hour conversations sometimes with people. Because once they realize that they're not in China while we're talking on the phone, we are both elevated into this, like I mentioned, like a haven of digital conversation where, because they don't know me personally and because I'm not Chinese, they can talk about Chinese things from different perspectives without feeling like they're betraying their sense of being Chinese. If they were talking to a Chinese person, they would have to say the one way Chinese views every single topic. And if they were talking to an American, they have to represent themselves as Chinese. And they have to say, but of course, parents have to berate their children. Like, that's just how you do it. Even after they say, I don't like being berated by my parents, but we have to, I understand that. But when they were talking to me on the phone, all of a sudden, I don't really like it when my parents berate me. Why do you think they do that? And then we'd talk about Chinese family structure, and yeah, we just have amazing conversations about all sorts of topics. Some topics did come up much more than others. Family is a good example. That came up all the time because Chinese people assume they have the closest families. And whenever they learned that I was traveling and I only saw my biological family once a year or less, they'd be like, yeah, American families aren't very close, I know. Or American families aren't very close, I learned about that. Chinese families are very close. So I can't travel because my family is just too close to each other, me and my siblings and my parents. And I would say, oh, but you said you really wanted to travel. So don't your parents want you to do the things you're interested in? And there'd be a loud, stunned silence on the other side of the phone. They'd be like, well, I can't talk to my parents about what I want to do. And this is like 40-year-old people. They're like, I can't tell my parents that I want to go to a different country. Well, if you guys are so close, then you can probably talk to them about a lot of topics. Oh, no, we're not close. We can't talk about things. We're close. I go to their house on holidays. I give them money sometimes. We go to each other's houses. We're very, very close. Okay, so you're physically close, but you can't talk to them about how you feel or what you want to do. No, they wouldn't understand. Okay, can you talk to them about your life? Yes, I can tell them about my work, how many hours I worked that day, how much money I make. And that's it. Can you talk about your relationship with your spouse, or maybe what you were telling me about how difficult it is for you with the new kid? No, I can't talk to my parents about that. That's impossible. They wouldn't understand. They would get very angry. Chinese families are too close. We can't talk about that. Okay, so it sounds to me like you guys are physically close, like your bodies are next to each other, but it doesn't seem like you have a very close relationship with your parents because you can't tell them all of the things you've been telling me that seem very important to you. And that's a typical conversation of how we would start and then progress into a deeper conversation about the stuff they really did want to talk about. Like family always came up, and Chinese people are taught, like in school, that their families are the best because they're so close. They're taught that from a baby until forever. It's just assumed in the culture and explicitly said in the culture. So until someone like me or someone else with a different perspective asks what they mean by close, a lot of the people I talked to said they never really thought about being close with your family meaning something like being able to trust them or have a conversation with them about something important to your values. And one of the things I would tell them was, I've done drugs before, like illegal drugs in the United States, and that's something I've told my mom. And I tell her the stories of when I was high on mushrooms, and she told me her stories of when she smoked weed in high school growing up. And I would just get the very funny and just great responses. There was no disbelief. They were just shocked that you could be actually close enough with a parent that you would be talking to each other on equal footing as people, as two people, rather than the authority figure and the idiot child. Because it's not just child. This stuff came up a lot, so I gotta get into the family dynamics of Chinese families a little bit. Oh, but like they didn't have sex ed in China until maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I know it started like sometime in the 2010s. Officially, they began having or teaching sex ed in schools in 1988, and it became officially being taught in half of the schools in China by 2003, I believe it was. But I lived in China for 6.5 years. I had many close friends and hundreds of acquaintances. I've met thousands of people for sure. And I would ask sometimes out of curiosity if they had sex ed classes, especially the girls I was dating who didn't seem to understand their body at all, let alone mine. And I never met a single person who had attended a sexual education class, and I never met a single person who received a birds and the bees talk from their parents. So there was like 1.5 billion people who had never had a sex talk. Just like the basics of like how it works at all. I hear that has changed, but nobody I talked to whenever we broached that subject had ever had a class about reproductive biology in humans. So the fact that I had had a birds and the bees talk with my parents, it was a common American responsibility to explain like the fundamentals of how reproduction works and how to have sex safely, that we even taught it in most of our schools in the country. And every time I explained that, the Chinese person on the other end of the line would just be like, "What? How?" And I'd have to explain what a sex ed class was, and invariably the answer was, "I never learned any of that." And we didn't have to get into it. I didn't have any birds or bees talks over the phone or anything. These talks about family or the birds and the bees talk were just to expose the Chinese person to how radically different the world was than they thought it was. And that wasn't a difficult thing to do, but I have to be careful doing it because, you know, if they say, this is how Chinese people cook. And be like, no, that's how everyone cooks. And I make them feel like an idiot, then they're not going to be interested in continuing to talk. And I'm trying to encourage people to open up their minds, to look at things through a different perspective. I think that's the most valuable skill anybody can have. So that's what I started to focus on, getting people to look at everything from a different perspective than they were used to looking at it. And like I said, 30%, like 1 in 3 people would call up and say, let's just talk. Great, let's do it. But the other 70%, like after 5 minutes of class where they'd be like, can you teach me vocabulary about blah, 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 blah? I'd be like, yeah, sure. Equine means to do with horses. After a couple of minutes, they'd say, I know that you're a teacher and all that, but I actually just want to talk and just have a conversation. Is that okay if we stop the lesson and then we just talk and I can ask you questions about traveling and that? And I'd be like, heck yeah. So with those guys added in, it ended up at least 70% of the people just talked up to have casual conversations. And I was still making $10 an hour. But that's what I like to do, which maybe you can tell from the podcast. I like to encourage people to look at things from a different perspective that I think will benefit them in some way. So all these casual conversations, I was making a little bit of money, which was perfectly satisfying to me, enough to house and feed myself, and I didn't have to touch any of my savings. I got to do my backpacking and meet new people in the real world and all this stuff, and I got to have absolutely fascinating conversations a couple times a day with people from all over China who, while I was encouraging them to open their minds and maybe appreciate a wider world, they were teaching me tons of stuff that I couldn't believe I had never stumbled across or learned about while I was living in China, that are like fundamental Chinese perspectives on how the world works, but they would be camouflaged in the civilized infrastructure of Chinese society while I was living there, so I wouldn't notice them. And they would come up in conversation with my students, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's why? And it would be some habit that I had noticed Chinese people doing for like 3.5 years, and then this person finally just explains it to me because they have nothing to hide, because like I said, we're in this in-between space. They don't really know me. You can talk to an anonymous person a lot easier than you can talk to someone that's really close to you a lot of the time. And it was cool. That's what was happening here. And sometimes I'd talk to kids. So there was this kid, Fred, and we talked at least once a week. I was part of his parents' intention to make him very good at English, very adept by a very young age, as most Chinese parents want. And I had been teaching for a few years at that point, so I was pretty comfortable talking to kids and encouraging them. And while I was doing that, I could also put in the mind-broadening ideas as well, seeds of tolerance and cultural perspective. So if Fred said something like, yeah, my dad, he works very hard. He has to go to the office 6 days every week. And I'd say something like, oh, that's very difficult. A lot of Americans have 3 jobs because the pay is not so great everywhere in the United States. Oh, but I thought Americans are rich. A lot of them make a lot more money, but the US is also very expensive, so they have to work a lot also. Oh. And then he'd say something else. But it's just like these little ideas because you know someone is taking something for granted. And I don't have to explain the whole thing. I just have to let them know the whole world doesn't start and end with your idea about what something is. And it certainly doesn't start and end with the idea of my idea of what something is. That's why I loved these conversations so much, and that's why this was such a great job for me. I got to do all the stuff in the real world I wanted. And then I'd have these great conversations and be introduced to new ideas or answers to questions about Chinese society that I hadn't known how to ask or hadn't even realized were there some of the times. But Fred had to call me so much, and he told me, like, explicitly that he liked talking to me, so he wanted to make sure I was there, and he, like, checked the times I was usually online, and I was like, all day. I'm pretty much online all day. So you can just call me whenever, it's fine. And we had a lot of good talks, and his English certainly improved with the more we talked. But sometimes he'd be bored, too, because he's a kid, and he's being forced to learn or whatever. And sometimes he would call me up and he would sound so sad, glum. And I'd be like, hey, Fred, how are you today? And he'd say, I'm good. Oh, okay. What'd you get up to today? I went to school. Yeah? Was school fun today? Did you guys do an activity? What's an activity? You know, like, did you cut shapes out of paper or did you play a game with each other? Yes, we played a game. And sometimes I just have to have a conversation with Fred for 30 minutes like that, pulling teeth. But he's, like most Chinese students, always responsive, so it's not as horrible as a recalcitrant American child. There is a built-in obedience to authority that I try to subvert whenever I'm talking to a student, but is also pretty great if you happen to be a teacher there. Or pretty useful anyway. I might have talked to Fred more than any other person on No, that can't be true. Because I talked to some people 2 hours at a time, and he usually only called up for like 20 minutes. There's this other kid, Jimmy, and they all choose English names. So in China, if you're Chinese, you choose an English name, and that's the name you use with other people, because they are taught that people from other countries cannot pronounce Chinese names, which, like, some names, like Roy, is really weird to say for a lot of Western tongues, so sure. But if your name is like Zheng, then Zheng, like, people can say it. But that's not what you're taught. That's not the Chinese way. The Chinese way, the Chinese understanding of how Chinese, the language works, is that only Chinese people can speak it, only because they were born in China. And if you were not born in China, then you cannot, and you are physically unable to. Oh, this is a great time to bring up the tongue story. Okay, so I had a assistant named Lily, and at the time I was using Rosetta Stone to study Chinese, and I was trying to say hospital, and I was doing great in the course, and then I got stuck on this word hospital, and it's pronounced E-U-N, and I thought I was saying that, and I tried to say it, no kidding, like 50 times, and it kept telling me I was wrong, and I did not know what was going on, and I was like, I can say this word, why does it keep telling me I'm wrong? And I could hear that it wasn't quite correct, but it wasn't giving me partial credit. I was getting the big red X, and I did not pass that item in the lesson. And I tried for like all day, and then after class, I went and I started trying it again. I still was getting it wrong, and I called Lily in, and I showed her Rosetta Stone and explained it, and showed that item, hospital, E-U-N. And she was like, oh, hospital, okay. And I was like, yeah, so E-U-N. And she was like, no. And I was like, okay, so how do you say it? And she said, E-U-N. And I was like, okay, E-U-N. So what's different here? And she was like, oh, your tongue is just shaped wrong. And I was like, oh, what do you mean by that? Because whenever a Chinese person said something outrageous to my sensibilities while I was living in China, which happened once every 30 minutes, a Chinese person would say something that they accepted as a fact of the universe, that I was like, that's an insane way to see the world. After like the second time, I wasn't like, what are you talking about? I would just say, oh, really? What do you mean? Because I didn't want them to get embarrassed and stop sharing this crazy piece of information. So when Lily said that my tongue was shaped wrong, which was the tentative title for a book I was going to write, Lily said, well, you're not Chinese, so your tongue is a different shape than Chinese tongues. So you just can't make that shape for yuan, so you're not going to be able to say yuan. And I was like, that's interesting. And my brain was like, all right, now we're using all power. We're going to do it right. We're going to learn this. And I was like, yuan. I said it wrong. And I was like, Lily, can you say it again? yuan. And I was like, okay. yuan. And I was like, that sounds pretty close, but I still wasn't saying it correctly. And then like a light bulb went off in my head. And I turned to Lily and said, Lily, okay, can you tilt your head down? So you're like bending your head down. And she did that. And I said, okay, now say hospital, say yuan. And she said, yuan. And she said it the exact same way, but because I had her tilt her face down, I could see her tongue move in her mouth, how it changed in the middle of yuan. And as soon as she did that, I was like, okay, thank you. And then I turned back to Rosetta Stone, and I clicked the lesson, and it said, yuan. And I said, yuan. And I got 100% all green correct the first time. And she had just watched me fail at it like 6 times in a row, and I had failed at it 50 times before that. And the look on her face was so shocked. Very satisfying, obviously, because of the achievement, but also fun because I got to explain that humans have tongues. Tongues are very malleable. We don't have differently shaped tongues. If I had grown up in China, I would have her accent, and if she had grown up in North America, she would have my accent. That the shape of the tongue wasn't so much important as where you were born and how you were brought up. So she asked me how I did that. That's the first thing she said after she just stared at the screen. Like she couldn't believe that I had just gotten 100% on the pronunciation. And then she looked back at me and she said, that sounded correct. How did you do that? And I explained to her that I watched how her tongue moved. And you could see her accepting that some not Chinese people can pronounce Chinese correctly. And it shook her to her core. And we were always friendly, but it was a cool experience that we shared together, and we talked more after that. But that's the kind of thing that would come up when I was talking to these people on Palfish. They would be much more free sharing these fundamental Chinese truths like, oh, well, your tongue is shaped wrong because you're not Chinese. That they know they shouldn't say out loud to not Chinese people, but on the phone with the anonymity, they felt a lot more comfortable just telling me things like, oh yeah, your tongue is the wrong shape. Chinese people have different tongues. But that was great because they would say that and I'd be like, really? And then I'd have them explain it. And then I'd usually say some simple fact or an analogous fact that would demonstrate how narrow that perspective was, and a cool conversation would open up. Almost every time. That pretty much worked every time. I can't think of a time when that didn't work. Because people want to learn, and it's interesting when you get to see a new perspective, especially if it's not attacking you or harmful to your worldview. It can be surprising and it might change your perspective on things, but as long as it's not directly attacking someone, they're much more receptive to learning in general. And what was great about Palfish was that these people were all calling up to learn. Even if they were having regular conversations, they were very clearly students of culture at that point, that they took the initiative to call me up and have these conversations, specifically with someone outside of their culture and experience. Or sometimes I'd talk, I think I mentioned Jimmy, who loved the Kerbal Space Program, which I've never played. Apparently you build rockets. That's like a rocket builder simulation game. Maybe I should look that up. Hang on real quick. Okay, yeah, it's a space flight simulation game. Jimmy wasn't into the flight part, as far as I can remember. Even when his rockets worked, all he told me about was building the rockets and how he liked to build the rockets. And every time he called up, I was like, oh boy, here we go. Like, hello, Kai. And his English was pretty good, so he just talked to me for 15 minutes and then would go. Hey there, Jimmy, how's it going? I built a Saturn IX rocket today. Okay, how did that go? So, like the big, tall platform that holds the rocket, and he would just explain to me for 15 minutes how he built this rocket. And it was fine. Like, I wasn't interested, but I was happy that he was so passionate about rocketry and about explaining it in English. And it's very impressive because he was like 7 or something. He was a young kid, maybe 9. But he would talk so much, sometimes I would just stop listening and but he would talk so much and so rapidly about specific technical rocketry details sometimes that I would sort of stop actively listening because I knew I wasn't going to follow every step that he was explaining rapid fire. And sometimes that's not what people were looking for. They just wanted to unload what was going on through their minds. And this wasn't every day, but sometimes someone would just enter a flow where they were explaining something to me, and I'd be like, oh, they don't need me to listen. They're not going to ask me any questions, or there's going to be no input from my side. They need to talk about this stuff. And so I would just keep the volume just high enough that I could tell there was a voice on the other end. And I would like pick it up every now and then and be like, yeah, no, he's definitely still on that stream of consciousness. And after 50 minutes, he'd be like, okay, Kai, thank you for talking to me. I love the space program. I will talk to you again soon. And I have to go eat snacks now. He taught me about rocketry at some point. I think I was actually interested in one of the things most of the stuff I just didn't even understand what he was talking about. But one of them he was explaining, I was like, oh, so the propellant. And he was like, yeah, blah, blah. So I did listen, but sometimes I didn't. And then we would, great time to you too, Jimmy. Hang up and then I'd go buy a beer on Jimmy and the Kerbal Space Program's dime. But to be honest, while I had many children callers, because I was not an unpopular teacher on Palfish, I had a lot of adult callers also. And learning English is a very young person's game in China. Like, you're supposed to learn it when you're young, and most people that go to classes weren't adults. There were plenty of adult classes in China, but it's just more kids learn English like everywhere else with every language. But I had a lot of adult students on Palfish, and I think part of that was because they wanted to learn about other countries. They were old enough, like that woman I told you about who had been kicked out of her town to go live in the mountains. Once you're older, it's different for everybody, but a lot of people, when they're like 70-something, it's really easy to look back at these truths you held in your mind as ironclad facts about the foundation of your reality. But it's very easy to see that most of the things you thought were so important and permanent are temporary and fleeting and malleable and different from your position, from where you're observing them. So I had a lot of middle-aged or middle-aged plus people talking to me about having finally come to terms with the world not quite being what they had learned it was their whole lives, as well as the perspectives they had been told about and accepted about the world. And now there were planes, and they could just call me up and just talk to me, which was impossible when they were growing up. That was always fascinating. When an old person called me up, that lady, I remember her probably the best because her story was so dramatic. Like, I think she had a sister and a brother, and they were allowed to keep 2 children. So she had to leave. She was the one chosen to leave the house. And she went to the mountains and built like a stick hut and had candles and drank river water and ate whatever she could eat. And she lived in the mountains. And they had like plantations that you could work on and eat sometimes, but sometimes they didn't have plantations to work on. Sometimes you just had to live in the mountains, because if you were counted as part of the census and you weren't being given food, that was a problem for Mao's 5-year plan. So he just had to erase half this generation of children, otherwise it would look like what was happening was that his 5-year plan was killing tens of millions of Chinese people because he wasn't giving food back to them, because he was collecting all the food from everywhere in China, in Beijing, and then he was giving that food to himself, the Communist Party leaders, and the factory workers got rice. And then he gave some food back to the country after he took it all, but he didn't give enough for everybody living in the country. And I had read the history about this, but I was finally hearing it firsthand from someone who experienced it and was not given food by Mao Zedong, who was not given food because there was a cultural revolution going on. So she didn't get to eat for like a decade. It was an amazing and difficult story to hear, just imagining this. She was like 20 years old, living in a hut she had to build herself in the mountains with a candle sometimes. And you might be wondering, well, can't her family bring her food, or can't she go back to the town and just get food and then go back to the mountain? No, because this is an informing dictatorship. If she went back and someone saw her parents giving her food, her parents could be executed. If she went back and asked someone for food, she would be shunned and she could be executed, and she would certainly be thrown back out of the town, because if they didn't do that, then they would be punished because they didn't inform on her, or they didn't punish the girl for coming back from the mountains. Then the townspeople who didn't punish her would be punished. So it's an insane time. If you want to read about some insane history, the Cultural Revolution is certainly the place to read about. Well, anyway, she's my definitive representation of many older members of China, part of the older generation, who called me up and would tell me their stories about growing up under Mao, or just what they saw these days, and how they couldn't believe how much the world had changed, how they couldn't believe that I was in their country teaching English, or how many people were in China now. It was pretty interesting talking to everyone on Palfish, and it was very interesting talking to this older generation as well. The more middle-aged, like 40, 50-year-olds, like not quite old enough to remember Mao, but not young enough to live in cell phones and global travel world, they were the ones who usually were most interested in different perspectives, and they were old enough that they understood they could learn something just by talking to me, not because I was a font of knowledge, but because I was happy to provide a different perspective. Like, if you're so used to looking at a problem a certain way, it's very difficult to see the solution to that problem, even if it's a very simple solution to do, unless you gain access to that different perspective. And that's what I was. I was kind of this sounding board, or like this hint pointing arrow where I could be like, or maybe da-da. And those were some of the most rewarding conversations I had, because these were 25 to like 45-year-olds. They had pretty important life issues that they were dealing with that are life-consuming and rapidly changing. And sometimes I was able to help these people, and that always was great. That always felt so good to help someone else who needs help. Ooh, actually, you know what? That reminded me of one of the younger kids. There was a kid who called me up one night, and he sounded normal enough. He asked me a couple of questions about school because he was in like high school or something. And then he asked a couple questions, whatever, that were slightly off topic. And then he said, I'm sorry, can I talk to you like about real questions instead of like a formal class? I was like, oh yeah, for sure. That's what I like to do anyway. Go ahead. But I knew something was happening. And he was like, so you're from what country? US. Okay, you're American. And you taught in China? Yeah, I moved to China for like a few years and taught, and now I'm traveling to other countries. And he's like, oh man, I wish I could do that. I wish I could do that. And I explained that he could, because there are teaching positions for Chinese people in the United States. It might be difficult for him, like right now, but if he just dedicated himself to getting even a basic teaching certificate, teaching Mandarin is huge in the US. Like, it's becoming more and more popular. It has been for 20 years now. And he was blown away by that fact. He had no idea that anybody outside of China spoke Chinese or was actively learning it, like many countries are. And he said, but doesn't everything seem so hopeless? And I was like, oh, like my red flag triggered, and I immediately thought suicide. I thought that right away. I was like, this is a dangerous, something else is going on that I didn't clock for like 10 minutes until just now. And it wasn't anything explicit, but anything like that. And that's a pretty common sentiment with Chinese students. So this wasn't crazy to hear, but I was like, well, at least we're on Palfish, so I can actually talk to this kid. And I just told him, nope, everything is not hopeless. You should definitely hope, and you should look for opportunities. You should look for what you like in life. And he said he didn't like anything in life, but I found something. It was like music, or it wasn't music. It was travel. He was interested in travel. He admitted he liked the idea of traveling to another country. And I was like, that's perfect. That one's super easy to do. You are lucky enough to be born into a time where you can get on a plane, go to Japan or Vietnam or the United States or wherever you would like to go. You can do that. And you're almost at the age where it'll be easy for you to do that by yourself. Yeah, he might have been 16. He was a young kid, but it was like 16, 17, 18, something like that. I know he wasn't in university because one of his problems was he was super stressed about the Gaokao, which is the test you take after high school that determines where you go to university. And it's like the metric by which you are judged as an individual when you're like 18. So you're 18, you take this test, and then the Chinese government says, you're a trash person, or you are good enough to begin your capitalist climb. And just so you know, the unemployment rate among people under 25 in China is like 25 or 30% right now. It's insanely high. So it's a difficult country to live in already. And the Gaokao pass rate is less than 10%, sometimes less than 1%, and the other 99% fail. Even if you do pass that test, and it's a very difficult test, it's way harder than the SATs. It's much more comprehensive, and it's much more in-depth in all subjects. And these teenagers know that. They are told that this is the test they have to pass, or their life will be meaningless, basically, and sometimes explicitly told that. Like, so when this kid started talking to me and felt really bad, I was like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, I understand enough about this test, and I understand enough about how Chinese society values individuals who don't pass tests, which is not at all. that at least I knew how to talk to him. I knew how to connect with him. And at least for me, I obviously like talking to people. I have conversations, and I feel like I can present different perspectives on things. So when someone's talking to me and it's clear they're depressed, I never combatively argue against what they are saying. If it's important. If I'm having fun, I might. But if it's depressed in a serious situation, then what I prefer doing is presenting a different perspective and calmly refuting their exclamations of despair, which are very common and often easy to refute because they're extremely hyperbolic most of the time. And that's what was happening with this kid who said, "There's just nothing I can do with my whole life." And I said, "Oh no, there are many things you can do. I thought the same way. I was a manager at a sandwich shop. Then I was looking for a video game controller on the internet, because that was what I like to do as a hobby, and someone posted a job for a English teacher in the wrong section of the website that I was on. So instead of a video game controller, I saw this job ad, and I actually applied for it. And then I got the job. And that was just an opportunity that was there that I would never have expected. But it was there, and I didn't know it existed, but it did exist. And I've been traveling, and I know people who are journalists, and I know some programmers, I know some translators, and your English already sounds pretty good. So there are many, many things left ahead of you in life. And he's like, "I don't know. It doesn't feel like there's anything." And I was like, "Well, I'm like 15 years older than you. And every year I realize how little I knew the year before. So there's always stuff to learn, and there's always new things to interact with." And he said something like, it would be easier if it's over. And that's when I was like, yep, okay, definitely a self-harming pathway here. He said something like, it would be easier if it's over, or something permanent like that. And I said, nobody knows what it's like when life is over. It may be easier, but you'd be missing out on all the life, on all the stuff you still have to do. He was like, yeah, but there's nothing to do. Like, I can't do anything, especially if I fail the Gaokao. And I was like, no, you're like 16 or whatever. You have great romantic relationships to look forward to. You talked about traveling. You have all the countries to travel to. And he was like, yeah, but Chinese people can't go anywhere with their passport. Which is a very common thing that Chinese people think, but they can go to like 150 countries visa-free or visa on arrival. I think the government tells them that they can't so that they won't leave the country. And I know Xi Jinping like canceled a bunch of visas or restricted them, like travel status-wise. But this is my wheelhouse. So when he was like, Chinese people can't travel, at the time especially, I just had all the details right there. I was like, I know you can go to Japan. I have a Chinese friend who went to Japan a couple months ago. She absolutely loved it. You go to Korea, they have a really cool cartoon animation museum that I went to, big beanbags you can sit on, really comfortable, free movie theaters. What do you mean free movie theaters? And I explained about the mini movie theater. Man, that animation museum is so cool that you can sit in and rent free movies and just watch movies for free on this movie theater or chill out in the beanbags or whatever. And I think he had pushback on the romantic relationships I mentioned also. And I just said, like, dude, there's a million different ways to start a relationship, and you have all of them to try. Like, you can, and try any of them. Like, whatever it is, just try it. Just be direct. Talk to someone you like. See if they want to spend time with you doing something you like. And if it works, great. And then if it doesn't, that's okay, because you live in China, so there's like 1 billion people here. And he like laughed a little, or like he chuckle sighed, like a teenager does, like, yeah. And it just kept going like that with him trying to explain to me why life would be easier if it was over, and me being like, you know what's cool? Woodworking. I might have actually brought that up because he was talking about he would have to get like a menial job or something like that. And I was like, well, I built all of the tables and chairs for my classroom, and it was like the most fun part of this whole school year. So I can recommend woodworking, at least. Well, how'd you get the wood? And I was like, it's actually plywood, just sitting on the side of the road. Those big pallets that they deliver things on. Yeah. Yeah, so I just pull those apart, take out the nails, and then nail it back together, cut it into place with a saw, and make a chair or a table out of that. And yeah, like I said, it just kept going on. And for he was really bummed out for the first long time, 45 minutes probably. And then that relationship side chuckle I got him to do was maybe after that point. And following that, we talked for another hour, and he just kept testing if there was a future for him, if it was possible that he had a future, really. Not that there was a definite future, but just if everything was over. He wanted to check over and over and over if everything for him was over. And every 3 answers I gave, I'd say even if the Gaokao goes bad, the world, all the things we're talking about, are still there anyway. But I'd sandwich that in between yeah, carpentry is cool. And even if you fail the Gaokao, it doesn't matter because the whole rest of the world is out there. And you might meet a girl, and I'll always sandwich it between 2 things, but I just keep throwing it out. So that idea was in his mind that even if this terrifying test that would heavily influence his life goes poorly, and in all honesty, in truth, in truthful fact, his life would continue, the world would continue, the rest of the world would be there. And there were 190 other countries around this guy, and he could go to most of them. And I think the thing he was most interested was travel, like a lot of people. And that was my perfect topic to talk about. So I just kept trying to encourage this kid. And then it was, I think 1:30 a.m. It was pretty late or something. I didn't want to let him go either. I wanted him to know that I was there as long as he wanted to talk. And I was there as a proud supporter of hope and interest and life and opportunity, that I was staunchly opposed to any sort of defeatism and any sort of idea that he shouldn't exist because he didn't know what to do with his life. And I didn't tell him that, I just showed him that by staying on the line with this kid. And it got better over the couple hours or whatever we talked. And then, yeah, like I said, it was late, and he said, well, thank you. I have to go now. I have school in the morning. It's kind of late. So thanks for talking to me and telling me about Vietnam or whatever the fuck I talked to him about. I was like, yep, it was really good to talk to you, Kevin. I don't know what his name was. Actually, I think he told me his Chinese name. And that was my first flag. I was like, wow, if he doesn't care enough to make up the English name, something's not going right in his world, because that's you have to make one in Chinese society. So he must have felt pretty divorced from the society if he hadn't chosen a English name yet. And then there was this pause, and I just waited for whatever he was going to say next, because there were a lot of pauses in the conversation before he said something else hopeless. And I checked that with optimism and facts. Optimism is fine, but it's useless without facts and practical options to support it. But this was a heavier pause. In this one, I could really see him it's weird how you can hear silence, but I could hear him weighing in his mind whether he was going to say what he was going to say next. And then he said, I was having a very difficult time tonight, and I was actually thinking of killing myself. And again, I didn't freak out or exclaim anything too big back. I just said, I could kind of sense that. I'm really glad that we got to talk, and I'm really glad that you know about all these things we talked about now, because there's so much to life, even if you were born in China. And no matter how your test goes, there's so much to life that I can tell you more about and that you will get to experience very soon. You're right on the edge of being a full individual, and it's not always easy, but it is always a fascinating world, and there are things that you will get to experience that right now you cannot imagine. I can promise that. If you continue with this world and you look out for opportunities and you follow your values, what you care about specifically, you are going to be shocked at how your life develops and how many wonderful and unique and crazy things you'll experience. Harming yourself doesn't help with any of that. You just don't have your life, and it's very valuable. So keep it. Call me up if you ever want to talk again. And remember how big the world is outside of China. How many countries there are, how many people there are like me who are waiting to talk to you, to meet you in whatever profession you want to do or however you want to live your life. I'm glad you called, and I'm glad we talked, and I hope you do great on the Gaokao. And if you don't, that's fine. You can figure this out, and people like me are here to help you and talk to you. And just to let you know that the world is way bigger than any of us can understand. And my brain was like on fire for those 2 hours because I really didn't want this kid to hurt himself. And I like inspiring others anyway, with truth as I understand it. So while I was doing it, I could hear the words like making an impact. Like the whole time, I was like playing a strategy game, trying to defeat the despair inside of this kid. And after my last like little speech, he said something like, yeah, I guess so. Or he agreed somehow, but it sounded like normal sullen teenager. He was like if you told a teenager that there's other fish in the sea after a bad breakup, and they're like, no, I know. Like, they're sullen, but it is a genuine affirmation of what you're saying, even if they don't consciously believe it at that point. And that's what this kid sounded like. He sounded better after I talked to him. And I was still in China, so it was just the first couple of months of Palfish in which this kid called up. And then he said he was going to go to bed, so he said thank you several more times and then went to bed. And I did hear from him again. But man, after that conversation, and like I said, that was in like must have been the second or third month, because I started using Palfish right before I left China. And I was like, yeah, that's what I'm good enough at and what I enjoy doing. I want to help people who can't see the light of the world. And I can because whenever I can't, I go to a new country and look from a different perspective, and there it is. There's the fascinating wonder of the world. I just had to take a couple steps to the right. So I was like, well, I'm definitely going to use this. Like I have other people to talk to who hopefully are not in such a deep hole that kid was in every single time. But if they are, I'll try and help them. And everybody had oh man, I had other pretty deep conversations with a lot of people as well. I guess I'll continue this in a second episode, because I have a lot happened in Palfish. I used it for several years. I think I used it even after I went back to China for a couple of years. So, like, while I was teaching at the Chengdu school, I think I was still using Palfish also, outside of my in-person teaching hours. So I definitely have... I mean, there's one pretty big story I can think of off the top of my head. I have several more smaller ones. So I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much for listening. I love that this like little teaching app I was going to use turned into this cultural learning platform from which I got to help people also while I was learning all these new things. Just fascinating. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you soon. I'm Bit of a Rambler. You can contact me at bitofarambler@gmail.com or all the socials. Have a good rest of your day.